So, hello, we are live. So, welcome. Hopefully, we'll have some people joining our third live stream on Build to Boom and are going to market for internal platforms. So, welcome to our third live stream. So, last time we were talking about marketing, and that was a lot about broadcasting and talking to our hopefully internal potential adopters of our platform. And today we're going to be talking about selling, which is this third stage of driving adoption. And David, I know that I feel really awkward about it, and I think you have found a lot of good ways of feeling less awkward about selling than I do. So I really look forward to this conversation.
Taken a really long time. It's not like it's it takes practice, and it takes a willingness to look at it differently. Because, we've all had bad experiences with salespeople. Whether you walk into a shop and they start like descending on you and asking if you need help, or, or if it's like someone in your work technology that shows up and just, they force you to have a meeting because of the vendor relationship, and then they bring a slide deck and they just read the slide deck to you line by line, word by word. And you're like, you ask them a question, and they look at the slide and they say, I'll have to get back to you.
Yes. Right? That can be like so awkward, right? When people do
I feel bad for people who have to do that, right? Because you can see that this person is like, I'm just reading the slide deck. Not, it's not my area or anything. And, and you don't want to be in that position. You don't want to be that kind of salesperson. So that's not the most effective way to sell. So when we transition from that broadcast medium, we transition to a smaller format where we're talking to people who have expressed enough interest that they're ready to sign, right? And in that case, you're dealing with one person, maybe 3 or 4, and your job is to get in and to listen. The biggest mistake people will do in like a sales situation is think that they're still marketing, and they will start with the big deck and trying to, kind of throw everything against the wall instead of just asking the customer, like, what is it you're trying to solve? And you ask questions, just a few, and you listen. And you try and understand what their context is, like make them feel listened to, right? And if you start off with that listening, then, and they've expressed themselves, when you start to talk about possible solutions, you'll have that context and you won't seem ridiculous. Because that's the other thing salespeople do is, right, they hear something and they kind of cut you off with a solution that isn't really relevant. And remember, these are internal. I mean, you have a lot of shared context already.
Yeah.
So you should be aware of what their needs are to some degree. And you should not be coming in like an outside force that just has no idea what's going on. But you don't know everything that they need, and so you need to listen. So first step, listen.
But that can be kind of tricky though, especially if it is internal, because I think if you're doing external sales, so to speak, right, you're speaking to people that you don't know, like you never met them before. But if you're internal, like for example, David, if we worked in the same company, you may be like, oh, I know Erica, I know what she works on. You may actually have a lot of more preconceived ideas about what I need.
Yeah, everyone, and that's probably, well, that happens in external too, right? People decide what, oh, we've got product market fit because we believe we understand the market thoroughly and our product is a perfect fit, and then nobody buys it and you're out of business. So I think getting out of your own head is why you go in and you ask questions and listen, because you're trying to figure out what you don't understand and what their context is, so that you can be effective when you're turning around and trying to give them a solution to their problems. Because yes, we tend to, and it's just a natural human thing. Like, you think what you work on is the most important, and if you've got a hammer, like, everyone must be, holding up nails for you to hammer in, right?
Yeah.
So, that's not usually the case, and the problems that people have, that where they need your platform, they may not even be approaching, their set of problems. The platform might be a smaller piece of it. It might be, painful, it might be a thorn in their side, but to think that also, fixing things with a platform is going to, in deployment, and whatever your platform does is going to fix all of their problems, might be a little off too.
Yeah.
So there's some humility required when you go in and sell, right? That you don't know everything about their situation.
Yeah, and what the pressures that they have may be very different from the problems you're actually able to solve. And sometimes, yeah, like, what are their right now problems? Like,
Yeah.
what are their current pains? And I think I have a question for you there. What if you were coming into a situation, and if anyone is listening and have good advice as well here, like, what are good, okay, so you've got the conversation, you've got the meeting, or so to speak, like, you've got this
Mhm.
opportunity, someone wants to speak to you, they've heard about what you are working on or the platform, or you have got this opportunity to have a conversation. What would be, so you're sitting there, like, the conversation is sort of about to start, and they're like, what is the first question you would like to ask the other person? If you are the platform owner, Dave, what would you like to ask your potential adopter or user? What is the first conversation starter question that you'd like
The
to
the
start with?
starter that I would usually get into is like, what are we doing here? Like, what is there that I can help you with? And what are the problems you're facing? Right? Not what is your system, what is your process, like trying to start mapping things, but just finding out what, sometimes you ask people what keeps you up at night, right? When you
Mm,
do sales, but that's not always appropriate. People don't like to be don't like to think about being kept up at night and having that kind of stress. But usually they're there for a reason, because they have a need. And
yeah,
the conversation starter is, you know you obviously have some interest. Like, what is it in particular that kind of brought you to us? And it all about, like, their motivations, right? And you don't even need to preface it with, well, are you interested in service X or Y, right? Because you want them, ideally, to open up, and for both of you to figure out, like, maybe the relationship might go in a direction. You might have preconceived notions on both sides of what you're
yeah,
going to solve, right? And
yeah,
having an open discussion about the problems we're facing gives you a lot more latitude to figure out, hey, they came to us for X, but or thought they were. When they started talking, we're actually talking about Y. We're talking about testing, not deployment, right?
yeah,
And you know, this conversation just took a shift into testing, and there are aspects of our platform that are really focused on testing, that are actually what they need to solve first before they start thinking about, other parts of the platform lifecycle and such. So I think that, again, being open to them discussing and maybe probing a little bit, to find out, well, like, why is this what you think you need to do? And again, getting a feeling for what their context is, and then helping them see, maybe, as an external party, like, the thing that you're bringing to the table is that you might be able to see things that they can't, because they're in the forest, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Bringing
the
some
other, yeah,
clarity.
exactly. And you can't do that if you don't let them tell you
Exactly.
what it looks like from their perspective.
So we have a live comment from Colin, so I'm going to bring it up on the screen here. So Colin said, one thing I've seen in platform engineering is a platform team focusing so much on selling, adoption, and meeting teams' needs that they let maintenance and feature requests from existing customers fall out of priority. How do we avoid that? So what are your
That's
thoughts on that, Dave?
that is that's a prioritization and maturity growth thing. So, and especially, I guess it comes at all different phases of the, sort of life cycle. First launch of a platform, later launch of a, platform trying to get adoption. I feel like there is a certain amount of product work that needs to be done either by a product owner titled that way, or just someone who is going to make the decisions about how to balance growth versus support. And you need to have some metrics and some indicators of whether or not you are delivering what you believe you should be or what your customers need. And if you have, so like a service level objective or service level indicators, and if you're communicating like that to your customers, we know what you need, we've agreed collectively, this is what service levels look like, then you should be monitoring that. And if you go out and do a lot of sales and a lot of new onboarding and those things suffer, there should be very clear signals to you. And I think the pressures are different for an internal product than an external one, right? Because this is sometimes a very clear cut business decision that you make when you're dependent on the revenue of the external users. That when you're doing product engineering and product development, and there could be a conscious trade-off of, we need to make new sales because our business model is such that, just focusing on the maintenance won't let us get through, right? So when you're internal, your drivers should be a bit different, and like they know where you live, right? So just letting them go unsupported is gonna, tank you in terms of customer relationships.
And that's also quite interesting. I did think about, as you were answering this question, Dave, that there is an analogy here to selling and external selling, because in external selling, we often have contracts that expire and we have to renew them and we go back into selling. And there's a funny thing internally that often we don't necessarily have competitors who come and try to come in when a contract is expiring to try and get those contracts. And that can often feel our existing internal customers might not have an option to go to a competitor, right? And therefore they can feel forgotten in a different way. So how do we avoid it? Maybe we do have to have a view of that. How do we renew our existing customers in a way? How do we sort of resell to them and look at their health? And you mentioned those SLOs and maintaining that relationship. And it's an interesting, we will talk about something that we call about the loop later.
And that will be important. But a frequent part of the sales cycle that isn't necessarily even just part of the loop is in the external world, especially services, is something called a QBR, a quarterly business review.
Yeah.
And that's a meeting between the account owner, it's usually the salesperson, and the customer. And they have a frank discussion of like where the relationship is and what's gone well. It's almost like a business level retro. And I think there is absolutely a place for that in, the internal software, internal platform world, where you are tracking your customers and your relationship with them. There's a bunch of tools we can have with that too. surveys, interviews, and we can get more into that in the loop. But throughout the thread of like all of the things we've talked about so far and that we will talk about is that you understand your customers, who's the buyer, who's the user, and keeping them happy, right?
Yeah.
And making them feel heard, communicating with them in a way that works for them, and that'll just keep going through all the other stuff that we have to talk about. So when you
Yeah.
sell and you make people feel heard and you're catering to the needs they actually have, that's keeping them in mind, keeping them happy as a customer.
I think there's a trick there, though. I'll wrap that up. I think there's also a trick if you can really align your existing feature requests. There's some interesting trick about existing feature requests and your new customers and trying to align those with your needs of your new users as well. That
And
after
there's
some magic
actually
happens.
and there's absolutely some alignment there, and it comes down to how you do your selling and who you sell to, right? Something we kind of talked about before, but maybe this is a good place to do it, is the way that you sell needs to be done in a way that you can deliver, right? You can't go out and you can't launch a platform and then bring 20 teams on, right?
Yeah.
You need to ramp up, and you don't want to sell to wildly different personas that need very different features up front, right? Or maybe ever. So like when you go through sales cycles, and this is very common for product companies too, right? They announce a new feature and then they use that as part of the sales cycle to go out and find customers that need that feature. They're not just going around and hunting for generic customers and then entertaining like everything that they might need.
Yeah.
And customers who ask for things that are not currently on the docket, guess what? When those things start coming up in the roadmap, the salespeople know, hey, this customer was asking for this feature. We're implementing it now. We didn't have it close before. Let's go back to them and see if this makes them interested in using the product.
Yeah.
They absolutely do that with an internal platform.
Yeah, because you can't be everything for everyone all at once. You don't have, or unless you do somehow magically have all the engineering power and resources and money to build everything for everyone all at once. Congratulations, that's fantastic for you. But a lot of us are not in that luxury position.
No.
So, but something that Dave, you and I've talked a lot about is especially I found it so awkward, right? I know that I have often been in the position, right, where we are told and measured. I've been often measured by the success of, we talked about the success of adoption, right? We want people to be successful when they adopt the platform, but a lot of those reports one have to share to the people who are interested in success in the situations I've been of my team is how many people have adopted the platform, are they in production, and so forth. So there is a pressure to get adopters onto the platform. So this awkwardness of selling, right? You kind of have that pressure behind you of you have that like, oh, you have to go into these conversations and with people and you feel a little bit stressed because and I used to feel so awkward about it. And I have to be honest, there was that pressure of like, oh, I need to show up and report that I'm having these conversations. And I have to show people adopting because people care that I'm not just having a team of engineers that are implementing a platform that no one's using, right?
Yep. And so it's an interesting conundrum, right? Because like you said, you've got the pressure behind you to show results.
Yeah.
And how do you not mistranslate that into your approach to potential customers?
Yeah.
So that they feel like that's exactly why used car salesmen put everyone off.
Yeah.
They've got to make commissions. They've got to, feed themselves and families, and like they feel that sort of desperate need to sell, and they're going to go out and do it that way. And how do you have the pressure from your own management and go out to customers and say, I need you to do this, whatever. And there's a mindset shift that you can put in place, right? That as you approach the customers, you can say, how can I help you? Right? You're there to help them, not to necessarily get people on the platform. And what you do is you say to your management, I've gone out and found X number of people to help. And the way we help them is by getting them onto the platform. It's kind of like the idea that, if you're going to be, if you want customers to be treated really well, then what you need to do is treat the employees really well.
Yeah.
And then they will treat the customers well. And then the customers will love the company. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of, it can seem like a weird order of operations to say, we need to drive adoption for the platform. Let's go get people on it. And it's like, all right, what we need to do is we need to go out and we need to figure out what problems we're going to solve for people so that they are eager to use the platform. Right.
Yeah. And I think for me, what became really important, so, obviously this was very stressful for me, right? And then eventually starting to realize some of the things we were saying, right? But who really has the problems that I'm solving? And starting to reframe some of what I was saying to maybe my leadership, like, who has the problems that I'm solving? Then it wasn't so much about how many people are on the platform, but out of the people who have the problems that I can solve, are we staffed to help? And how many of the people who have the problems are we actively engaging and helping? And that becomes a much more reasonable success metric, right?
Yeah.
Because
rather than some bulk number, utilization number. And it's really important that you've done the first couple of steps of knowing your market, doing the marketing, finding the product market fit, because if you have that kind of discussion, here's who we're going to help. And then you figure out, there's not many people with that. Like this is that whole, did I build the right thing? Did I build what people need? And if you have, and you identify that group and you say, like you said, go to management and say, here are the people we can help and are helping.
Yeah.
And this is what adoption means, is that we're actually solving problems for this particular group.
And also talk about that people, and being aware that people will be running into this problem. People may be in the pipeline. I think this is also a funny thing, like the sales pipeline. I remember the first time I heard about the sales pipeline, like people are going, people are, not everyone are ready to be sold to right now.
Yeah.
Like, you mentioned this earlier, like about having those features that, we don't have them yet, but like being aware of that pipeline, like, now you have the feature and you can come back to these people later. But I think the other thing that I've learned from our conversation, we talked about this in our presentation in London, Dave, is this consultative selling. Obviously, you talked about listening earlier in the conversation here today. And that I didn't know about that. That's obviously a thing before you taught me about that, Dave. But I think that is super cool.
You can use it for almost anything. I've always sort of naturally used it, and talking to someone I knew who had done sales for a SaaS product. It was actually like conferencing software, and you would think like that's something you just buy, right? And you just sell it on features. And what they did is they went in and they would talk about the problems that they had communicating.
Okay.
And what are the problems you face and how can we help you solve them? And that's very different from saying you need this XYZ video conferencing system with these features and sort of what you do when you kind of push forward is you're as just pure sales, you're making the customer figure out how they could use this.
Okay.
And when you consult with them, you sit down, you find out what the problems are, and then you're putting the thinking. So consultants do is they take in information, they think, and they add value
Yeah.
to that information. And that's what you're doing when you're doing consultative selling. You're going in and saying, I hear you have these problems. We have this potential solution to your problems based on what our product does. And the other side of consultative selling is being honest about what you can or cannot do. And
Yeah.
not, you know, if you're asking questions and listening and kind of processing the situation,
Yeah.
that also means that you're going to potentially decide, instead of the customer having to decide and dig through all the
Yeah.
features and everything and say, this doesn't kind of work, this may not, you can tell them up front, like, maybe this won't work for you, right? And that kind of honesty will be very refreshing for a lot of people, because how many people have bought a product and figured out well after the fact, oh, it doesn't actually work for our use case.
Or like, this is a little bit tricky. It's really interesting. I read about this psychology thing that they did a test apparently about, I think I brought up running shoes before, but this was also about shoes. But I think this is a common thing that people buy. Not everyone, but a lot of people have feet. Not everyone have feet, but a lot of people do. And this was about shoes that they trialed this on, and there was the same shoe. Okay, same shoe.
Mhm.
One ad for the shoe just talked about what was good about the shoe and its
Mhm.
features or benefits or whatever, just good things about the shoe. Then same shoe, different ad or page about the shoe, but it also said a couple of things about the shoe that wasn't that great, like some
Mhm.
drawbacks, so like honesty about the shoe.
Yep.
And then they measured sales of the shoe. And the one that had a bit of honesty thrown in had more sales, like completed purchases. So it's like the A/B testing, right?
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
like,
It's so, it was easier for them to experiment than, the old-fashioned, yeah,
yeah. And
that's
they found that the honesty of okay, it's like, it's great, but it's not perfect, led to
yeah,
more sales of the shoe.
because nothing is perfect. Everything has downsides, right? And
Yeah.
people are perfectly willing to deal with downsides for things
Yeah.
if they know it's there, right?
Yeah.
So if you surface it up front and give people the trade-offs they might be making, or, just allow them to make the decision and make it easier for them, they can make themselves okay with it. And as long as your value is greater than, as long as the upside is higher than the downside, then you've
Yeah.
got a better chance. And they know, they've got then a known quantity to work with.
Yeah.
So I like that example, because it's relatively easy to be honest. I think there is a huge fear on the side of salespeople that if you're honest about even the smallest thing, you'll be
Yeah.
seen as not being strong, not having an amazing product,
Yeah.
and that's another thing that shouldn't be as much of an issue inside, with an internal platform, because you're all part of the same company, right?
Yeah, you
You're
well,
all motivated towards the same goals, right?
exactly.
And
Like,
nobody's gonna go out and sell something internally that will just make a mess of things, right?
yeah.
This is a lot of external sales, right? That will come in and sell to you, and they'll do what they need to make their commission. And, if it doesn't work out for you, then okay, take it up with whoever. But if you're building stuff, you're all impacting each other. Right? If you're making engineers more efficient, making the company more profitable, that's all good for everybody. If you're not doing that, that's you know that's not an outcome anybody wants, right?
And people will find out if
Yeah.
you are like overselling or like, oh, this is amazing, or solve all your problems or something like that. It's People will quite quickly find out. And if you lose credibility internally, that is not gonna help you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
but
you're losing out on the chance of building trust. And the trust is a huge factor in selling successfully. And, there's a kind of maybe tenuous early trust that, you're someone they can talk to, and that, you're willing to listen, and, your ideas are kind of in sync. And then there's, that deeper trust that you are someone who, makes promises and will deliver on them, right? And
Yeah.
that's super important for a salesperson to be able to have a continued relationship, right? When you make promises you don't deliver on, that you're unreliable. And so people are not necessarily going to so easily, consider buying anything from you. If you are reliable, then maybe you can get on to the next phase of trust, right? Which is
Yeah.
like doing this consultative selling. Like our ultimate goal is to be a trusted advisor, right? And
Yeah.
have them come to you. I think you had that, right? You
Yeah,
you you
like
got
I
to that
found
point
that by
where you were talking about.
accident. Like, because I think there was a situation where I thought selling was so awkward that I just tried to be helpful. But it's this part where I don't know how to do sales. And I instead was like, I just want to help people. And it became being a trusted advisor and people coming back and being like, oh, Erica, I have this other problem. And sometimes it was not me who could help them with that problem, but I could help people find other people.
Yeah. Yeah. And your ability to be honest about, well, I can't solve this for you, but I'll help you anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Help you
And
find the people
that's
who can help you.
because you keep helping people, and eventually they bring you something that you can solve. And, as an internal platform, you want to avoid ever getting into a bubble where you don't understand what people need.
Yeah.
Um, and if they stop coming to you for solutions to their problems, you're gonna have this shrinking scope of understanding of what you need to do to build the right thing for the right people. And that goes into our next phases too that we have to talk about. But maintaining trust in the sales process is like it's the first place where you're making connections with people, and it's a place to start with building trust, and then you've just got to carry that through. And the future stuff we're going to talk about with maintaining the system, and then finally the loop.
I'm like, I think there is so much in sales though, like where sales and customer success is like so overlapping as well. You will see in many companies that the head of sales is in smaller companies also the head of customer success,
Mhm.
which is kind
Why
of
don't you
interesting.
define it, since not everyone always, I find it a very natural thing, but what is customer success? How is it different from sales in sort of a very basic sense, right?
Yeah, this if you get the Erica explanation, which may not be academically correct. Who knows? Uh, so customer success is ensuring that sales is often that's the closing, right? So you have
Mhm.
ensured that someone is agreed to adopt or purchase or get on board, right? They
Mhm.
haven't yet actually adopted anything. They
Yeah.
haven't actually yet consumed your product. They've just agreed to
Mhm.
it. So in external selling, they have signed the papers. They are going to use it. Whereas customer success is the journey that starts after. Now they are going to start using it. They're going to onboard. They're going to get to adopt or use the
You're gonna
product.
educate them on how exactly it works, right?
Yeah. And they're going to go on this journey, say, coming back to that question they maybe even Colin asked earlier, like they've become an existing customer now.
Mhm.
But that happens after the initial customer success because we have the initial part where they're going to adopt and ideally get to production. They're going to
Mhm.
be operational on this solution. So if you take a really simple application, they get onboarded, users get on it, and they are using it. So, for example, by the way, right now, me and Dave are using a tool called StreamYard to stream this live stream. So if we, for example, we say we use this thing, we decided to use it. That was us being sold to. We decided to use it. But now we're actually using it. So customer success is us actually being here live, streaming successfully, and you watching us live. That is customer success. But if we later, then we get to other problems. If we then have problems or feedback on this platform, that would be now the continuous relationship that would have with us. But yeah, we are successful because we're here and we're successfully streaming this live stream. And but yes, often people who are, they see in smaller companies, at least, you will have the head of sales also be the head of customer success, because is a sale really successful unless people actually get to
the worst thing is selling things that people end up not using at all, right?
It's
because
just,
they have a license, or they have seats, or they have the software, but they don't take them. I mean, that's a fairly common thing. Like, yeah, we bought the licenses, but we haven't rolled it out. Like,
yeah, the users aren't using it. That's like back to the conversation we had before about the buyer and the users. The buyer was like, yeah, great purchase decisions. The user were like, nah.
Yeah. That's a really awkward. So that's why you have to have that, and why it's so much a part of sales. Because if the customer doesn't adopt, then your renewal is going to look kind of bad, right?
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, we've been paying this for a year
renewal.
and we don't really use it. So yeah.
Sales does care about renewals. They want the customers to keep renewing, and this is, you should care about this as a platform leader. You do care about people actually adopting, and so maybe this is actually an interesting point about the selling and internal selling. Yes, you aren't truly closing unless you haven't onboarded the agreement. Oh, this is very interesting. I feel like we have talked about this, Dave, but I think it's interesting to talk about it here now. Like, in external sales, we close when we sign and we get the money.
Yeah.
But in internal selling of a platform, did we truly close? We kind of close when someone says, oh, we're going to allocate time to adopt, but we didn't truly close until they actually use it.
When they're in production, right? Because how often do you get someone experimenting with something in a sandbox or whatever, but you don't really have the actual sale in hand until they've got something, like they're committed to running it, right? Because they could get partway in and decide, this isn't for us, and suddenly you thought you had a user and you don't, because all they have to do is commit time. Well, they can uncommit that time just as easily. I think there's another bit to this, like with how internal customers are customers because they have options, right? It's not always the case that your platform is the only way to get things done. And because especially with a newer platform, well, they're probably already, I mean, they're an existing team, they have a solution.
Somehow they ship their software. Their software exists.
They can just keep doing what they're doing, right? So that's always option A, is not to do anything. Yeah. And you can sometimes force that or whatever. The other option is to, get a SaaS or another provider, like get something else.
And if you're a large company, sometimes that happens.
It happens a lot, right? Yeah. I mean, this is the whole beginning of shadow IT. Whip out your credit card and suddenly you've got services that some IT organization hasn't been able to provide. And that still happens, and it's a valid thing. So thinking of yourself as having competition is helpful to understand the customer mindset too. You're in a way competing for their business and their time, right? They're spending time in order to buy what you're selling, and you really need to make that rewarding for them. And if they don't get that in the onboarding process, like they don't actually get to the point of delivering on your system, yeah, you're going to go through users, right? I saw another comment come in
Yeah.
about not engineers not using something that we built is heartbreaking. It's really it's a good point that you want to be involved with your customers while you're building, while you're designing, and then while you're building. And we talked about this in the marketing section about having like pilot users or more industry lingo design partners, right? That are in there with you, shaping how the thing gets built, becoming your first use cases and success stories. And yeah, it's building in a vacuum is one of the most dangerous and risky things you could do, because you could just end up with something that just it doesn't fit. I've done that a few times, and it is painful. Like you build something, you spend sometimes years, and it ends up getting mothballed, right? And that's a classic story in just regular engineering, physical products. Like people say, I worked on this for, someone's had a career of 25 years and has never actually gotten a product out into the world
Yeah.
because, it's very common to have them canceled. So we don't want to be like that. There's not a whole lot of value because of internal platforms and what they do. It's especially bad for us to build the wrong thing. Because if we build the wrong thing, we've spent time and money for the company that is a waste. We've taken all that time to not accelerate other people when we could have been.
Yeah.
And that's like a double whammy, because our goal was to help the whole company become more efficient, and we didn't do that. And then we took away by spending time and effort on things that people don't actually need, and we're just going to toss.
And sometimes though, you built the right thing, but you haven't made the right thing easy to use.
Yeah.
And sometimes the right thing was built, but the right thing is hard to use. So I actually had very recently, because I've been very involved in open source recently, and I had this conversation, and someone said, what about this feature? And I was like, oh, that feature exists actually in this open source solution. And I'm like, but that's not in the documentation. And I'm like, I know. And they're like, oh, but it should be. And I'm like, I know. It's like a merry band of wonderful volunteers who's pulling this together. So yes.
It
not
should
everything,
be, but it isn't.
Yeah. And I think so. Of course, open source and sometimes this sort of volunteering time that happens in open source is a little bit different from an internal platform that's been invested in with a business outcome. So there's a difference there. What I wanted to say with that is something, especially if you're in a leadership position in a internal platform, expressing the importance of making it easy to adopt and checking in multiple times is important, right? Like that takes time. And it is an important activity. Creating both the activities and the material and things that makes it adoptable is really important. So yeah.
It's a really good, and everyone's experienced this heartbreaking disappointment of people not using the things that you've built, especially in platforms. It almost seems like a rite of passage to build, some feature or sometimes a whole platform that people end up not using. So definitely something we can learn from. And that's why, the sales process, the design and build is in part of the selling process. Like you need to be out there. And this is a question you brought up before we got on, is what how do you do sales for something that doesn't exist?
Yeah, I was wondering, Dave, can you sell something that doesn't exist? Because I feel like I have been sold stuff in the past where people are sort of selling almost like they sell a roadmap item, and I'm like, how am I supposed to buy something that doesn't exist? And also, is that okay to do?
And I think the key there is it goes back to the honesty and having a clear picture of what you offer, and you're doing the consultative selling, and you're being honest about what you can and can't do. And you're not going to sell the customer something that they would think exists, but does not, right? That's your worst problem with vaporware, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very common sales tactic to go out, sell the thing, and then build it once you've got the money to fund it, right?
Yeah.
Which is just a terrible experience for customers. If you're honest about what the thing can and can't do, in a way, you're more likely to be selling things that don't exist. And what you're selling is prioritization of the things that you will build into the product. And that's an interesting place, as it's part product and sales and marketing, of deciding how are we going to handle the 80% of the market that we're trying to serve by building the right things in the right order. And that's all part of, especially internal sales. Like, we're building this stuff for all of you, and your stuff falls into the roadmap because we know like 5 other teams that need this, as opposed to telling somebody, your thing is in the backlog because you're the only one asking for it right now, and we'll figure out over time if we have other people who need it. But we need to get the stuff that's going to serve as many people as we can. And that's a really important bit of honesty.
Yeah.
You want to be able to be transparent about your prioritization.
We have, building on that previous conversation, perhaps what you sell is the partnership to build a tool together with platform. And I think I definitely played that card before, like that collaboration, that actually inviting people to build together, because sometimes I haven't had the resources on the platform team.
Very common in the product world to have that kind of initial, you attract your first customers by saying, help us shape what this thing is going to be. Those customers can be dangerous sometimes because they can take an outsized, if they're not representative of the 80% and they start like dictating practically everything you do, that can become its own problem. But with internal users, not so likely, right?
Yeah,
because
and internally,
they're them.
Yeah, but internally, what I've done is literally borrowed the engineering resource and said, "You build it. You put the hands on keyboard. Like your engineers are going to build this."
We'll give you a framework, to run within, and we'll partner with you, and then you don't have to operate the platform. You get the stuff. You get the stuff you want. We get the features built, and then we operate it.
Yeah, as long as
we can pull other people into it, right?
Yeah, like you got to work with my team. We build this thing together. You get the feature you so badly want. But yeah, your feature that I don't know if this was exactly what the person was referring to with with the comment, but that is what I've done internally sometimes when someone really wants something, but I don't have the resources to allocate to it. I've been saying, well, you have engineers on your team, and they are very capable engineers.
Yeah,
and let's do this together. We can.
And
make
it's
it happen.
It is a very good point. You want, and the platform engineering maturity model from the CNCF, considers this like one of the highest goals, is getting a participatory platform and doing like an inner source type model of, getting contributions from outside just a fixed platform team. But you don't have to wait until, this level of maturity. You can bring people in up front and when you're trying to bootstrap and you're trying to
Yeah.
make the case for the business value of this thing. Because
Does
if they can help you build features that 10 other teams will use, they get the feature and you can turn around and, help 10 other teams too.
Oh, wow, this is a really interesting thing that you just brought up, that this is something that happens from the platform maturity model from the CNCF, that this is in like the higher tier of maturity.
Mhm.
Because from my lived experience, this was actually in my early journey of building a platform team, was something that I did at the very beginning, where I
Mhm.
partnered, because when I started building out a platform team inside of a company, when I at first only had 3 engineers on a platform team, and the product teams were vastly outnumbering this very, very small platform team, the only way I was going to be able to build platform features was to partner very, very
Mhm.
smartly with very clever and very intelligent and capable engineers on the product teams who were already building platform features on the product teams to help them contribute the things that they were already building into a platform framework.
I think there's a level of just personal maturity there that isn't always present because, the platform engineers and team can be very proprietary
Uh,
about the thing that they're building and not wanting to let other people touch it, right?
uh,
Not even wanting to let other people see it until it's perfect. And that's a problem in and of itself that I think, is part of that whole initial phase of the build out, and kind of like what um, we kind of avoided in the talk in London,
yeah,
but it is building the actual product is all part of going to market.
yeah,
And how you build it is very impactful in terms of like when you build it and how you build it. And that whole like keep it to yourself until it's done, not usually a great idea. And opening it up, good idea, but requires a lot of maturity to be able to take code from other people, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah. I just didn't know this. It was interesting for me. I know I went off on a tangent there, but that was something
No,
that
that's
I
all right.
didn't know about. That was because we only live we kind of live in our own little bubbles and lives, and we kind of know how we ourselves lived our own little experience, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, you kind of think that everyone did it the way you did it, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We often live that life, I guess. And I was like, well, I did so much trying my best to cobble something together with all the people I could find from
That's,
as many
that
places.
sort of collaborative pulling together is a fairly common change mechanism, right? There's models around like, well, how do you make change happen? Well, it's not always just get a sufficiently staffed team together. A lot of times you got to get a movement to happen by, cobbling something together. So, yeah.
Finding the people. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
I saw you doing something smart over there. Maybe we can.
Yeah, that's how change happens.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't see anything we've missed.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And we're sort of up on time, coming up on time. But yeah, I think ultimately we talked football selling. Well, went there on a bit of a tangent. But there was what I've really enjoyed from reflecting on selling is before we got into this topic on selling, as we prepared for that presentation we had in London, I was frankly under the impression that I didn't do selling, Dave. That
Mhm.
you know, I had that moment where I was very stressed about the fact that once in my career, I had that pressure of increasing number of adopters, and that was just very awkward, and I didn't like it, and it was very stressful, and I didn't like the idea and the notion of even increasing this number. It was very, very stressful. So I know that I don't like selling, and then I simply didn't do it. That's how I believed I had solved my problem,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And then from our conversations, I had learned that no, I hadn't stopped doing it. I had actually changed how I
Change
did
how you
it,
did it. Yeah.
which actually was a form of selling. I just didn't know it, which was consultative selling, which was changing into a listening and helpful way of selling, which actually was selling, even though I didn't know it at the time, which in a funny way was a way more comfortable way of selling. And then there was a couple of things that in the talk in London that we looked at in that summary from our conclusions from our conversations was about being curious, listening to the problems, and also remembering that not all problems are yours to solve. And
Yeah. There's a great book about this method of selling with a funnily awkward name. It's called
okay.
Getting Naked.
Oh,
So,
that is an
yeah,
awkward name.
so awkward. It's by Patrick Lencioni, and it's about the methods of selling that a small consulting company does versus like a larger consulting company. And it's all about being honest and vulnerable. That's the other thing is being honest and doing this consultative selling is a vulnerable thing. So you have to admit that there are
Yeah.
things you don't know. And that's really tough for salespeople to say, right? I don't know is like the most that they will ever admit is I need to get back to you, right? Or I need to get someone back to like to
Yeah.
say that you don't know or I can't do that is, kind of like anathema for salespeople. And so this is it's a great book. I'm gonna see if I can join the chat and actually just paste it. Nah, I gotta connect to YouTube or something. But if you want to, there it is. Put a link in our chat. We could post it somewhere. I think there's a good bit of writing we can do around this topic too, and get people to understand that being vulnerable with customers and doing consultative selling is going to be it can be a game changer.
And
all
then
right.
lastly, though, I would say if you are doing selling and you are talking to people, don't forget to talk to them again. There was not a
Yeah.
one-off conversation. Sales don't happen in a one conversation. Decisions don't happen in a single conversation. They happen over multiple conversations, and decisions often happen when you don't speak to people. Decisions happen in the silence between conversations.
I feel like we just came up with another whole half hour to hour of like managing the sales process, but we'll get to that another time.
But yeah, remember silence and the time in between is really important, and don't sell past the close. Many people try to do that. So, what does that mean? Wow. But there's so much content on sales out there, and there's people who are really good at it. So Daniel Pink, by the way, another Daniel out there that you can follow, and content and books to read. So thank you for tuning in. And remember, if you're an engineering leader, if you're in engineering, don't feel bad about that. You were never taught sales or marketing or guide to market or any of those things. You are navigating some tricky topics when you are trying to drive adoption and managing a whole internal platform. I know that it's not easy, and I don't find it easy. So you're not alone. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.